Good Shabbos, everyone. So a few weeks ago, I got such positive feedback for talking about watching Star Wars that I decided for my remarks today I would give you some more insight into my television viewing habits. It's interesting what people comment on in sermons. Perhaps my all-time favorite show was Madmen, which aired on AMC from 2007 through 2015. And this show followed the life and career of a fictional Madison Avenue advertising executive named Donald Draper through the 60s and the early 70s. And Mad Men was considered, quote-unquote, prestige TV. And what I learned from watching that show was that you can analyze and learn from a piece of TV or film the same way that you would analyze a piece of literature, or perhaps in Judaism, a sacred text. In all those media, there are the words that are spoken or written, and there's everything else around the words that help you more fully understand the story, the characters, and the situation. Mad Men was particularly known for its use of clothing to tell stories. And costume designer Janie Bryant won 4 Emmy Awards for her meticulous work on every outfit worn by every character. She described her work by saying, "I help to tell the story of a character through silhouette, color, tone, and texture." Her work in recreating the fashion of the period and in using the clothing choices as plot devices was so highly regarded that Don Draper's signature gray suit and fedora are now on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Don Draper, according to this story that is slowly revealed over the course of the show, was born in deep poverty and grew up in terrible circumstances. His real name is actually Dick Whitman, but with the help of a mix-up in the Korean War, he is able to steal a dead soldier's identity and start a new life. While he was never given a chance as Dick Whitman, kicked around by other people, when he is Don Draper, he is able to use his formidable creative skills to build a successful career in advertising that makes him incredibly wealthy. But at the same time, he can never fully escape where he came from, and the show often depicts his inner conflict between his two identities. One way that this conflict is depicted is through the use of clothing. No matter what chaos his life is in, when he puts on his incredibly sharp tailored suits and ties and slicks back his hair, he becomes the confident Don Draper who can win over the most difficult clients. One critic describes his dress clothing as the suit of armor he puts on that protects him from anything that comes at him. At other moments, his clothing and his appearance is haggard, and this represents him at his worst when he can't escape from being Dick Whitman. Don Draper is not particularly a good person because he can't escape those negative influences of his childhood. But when he dresses for the part, he can play the confident executive, the devoted husband, and the loving father. For him, the clothing that he wears is a disguise that hides the darkness underneath, just enough for him to get by. I think of this cynical use of clothing by Don Draper as we study Parshat Tetzaveh, with its extensive focus on special clothing. Parshat Tetzaveh teaches that the clothing choices that we can make help us tell our stories, but they also have the ability to shape those stories. The example of Don Draper is a negative one, but the Torah provides us with a more positive example. Clothing plays an important role as a plot device in a number of biblical stories, including Joseph, and the story we'll read in a few weeks, the story of Mordecai in the book of Esther, who goes from wearing sackcloth to wearing the clothing of royalty at the end of the story. But in today's Torah portion, we read specific directions about what clothing specific people should wear at specific times. As God continues to describe the Mishkan, which will serve as an earthly home for the divine presence, God instructs Moses to commission his brother Aaron to serve as the first Kohen or priest. Aaron's 4 sons will serve together with him and succeed him after death. Their sons will follow them, and the family of Aaron will continue to serve in the temples for all time. Today, people who identify as Kohanim believe that they can trace their lineage all the way back to that first family. In its earliest form, the job of the Kohen was to preside over the rituals in the Mishkan, to officiate at judicial proceedings, and to teach the members of the congregation. It is a daunting full-time job, but the first details that God gives Moses are not about the job itself, the task of the job, but rather about what the Kohanim are to wear. Since the priest would serve in God's home on earth, his clothing had to be made of the same precious materials as the Mishkan, and his outfit included a robe, a tunic, a headdress, a sash, an ephod, and an ornamented breastplate. Now, a form of this outfit was used by priests throughout the Second Temple period. And while these later priests may have traced their authority to the line of Aaron, we know from Jewish history that many of them were corrupt and used the priesthood to enrich themselves at the expense of the people they were meant to be serving. Others maintained the facade of piety while they brought idols and other pagan practices into the temples, like in the story of Hanukkah. Rabbi Alex Israel perceptively describes this use of the ritual clothing. There are times in which the clothing is at dissonance with the person who wears it. At times, the clothes obscure and hide our persona, presenting instead a new image, a projection of the way we want to be seen, different from the way we really are. This is true of many uniforms that present an image that aims to represent a product. It is for this reason that certain dictators dress in military attire. They wish to present an image of strength and force. The Hebrew word beged, for clothing, is made of the same letters, bet, gimel, and daled, as the word for betrayal or deception. He's pointing out that, like Don Draper, many Kohanim used the clothing of the office to hide their inner corruption. But the earliest priest that we read about today in Parshat Tetzaveh told a different story with his clothing. Students of Torah have noted that Parshat Tetzaveh is the only Torah portion from the beginning of Shmot until the end of Dvarim that does not actually include the name of Moses. The most important character of the Torah is missing only in this parsha. Now, while this factoid is probably just a coincidence of how the Torah portions were broken up, the Torah commentators like to use it for homiletical purposes. A midrash recorded in the Talmud teaches that God intended for Moses to serve as the Kohen, for Moses to serve as the priest. But when Moses repeatedly turned down God's commission at the burning bush, God made the decision to later take this honor away from him, to take the responsibility away from Moses, and to give it instead to Aaron. In this reading of the story, Aaron never expects to take on the job until it is suddenly forced on him in today's Torah portion. And I imagine the trepidation that he had felt at this moment. There's Moses, his brother, Moses who talks to God, who stood in front of Pharaoh, who mediates between God and the people, who literally argues with God when God is angry. But Aaron was used to just being the sidekick, who helped when needed, when called upon, when Moses was not able to speak, who stood in his place. But now Aaron was going to be the one in front, the one who had to take the lead in this important area. Perhaps this is why God gives him the elaborate clothing of the Kohen, because God understood that the way that we present ourselves in the world can actually shape the confidence that we feel in difficult situations. Aaron may be nervous and scared, but when he puts on the official uniform, he truly becomes the priest that he has the ability to be. The Talmud alludes to this when it teaches when their vestments, when the Kohanim wore their sacred garments, the priesthood, the kehunah, came down upon them. But if their vestments were not upon them, their priesthood, the kehunah, is not upon them. For Aaron, the clothing is not a disguise that hides an inner weakness, but rather a tool that brings out his inner strengths. And I find this to be an incredibly encouraging story. Talking to colleagues who are clergy, but also to people in many different professions. I've learned that many of us sometimes face a kind of imposter syndrome, a feeling of not being good enough to do what we are doing, despite what titles or records may say. It's that nagging feeling that no matter what we do, we will never live up to an imagined ideal. For me as a clergy person, it's looking at my family members who came before me, like my father and my grandfather. I can never imitate my dad's artistry, copy his artistry on the bima, or duplicate my grandfather's Talmudic knowledge. But I know that when I choose the details of the way I present myself to the world, it does include my clothing, I think about the stories that I want to tell about myself as a rabbi and as a person. When I read Parshat Tetzaveh, I think that Aaron is that little voice in each of us, that little voice that tells us that we will never be good enough. But the gift that God gives Aaron with his special priestly clothing is the ability and the authority to tell his story to the world through his actions. It's a gift that God gives to Aaron, and it's a gift that each of us have when we choose the way that we present ourselves to the world. Shabbat Shalom.